Good afternoon, everyone, both online and here in the room in the Public Record Office. My name is David Huddleston. I'm Acting Director of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, or PRONI, as it is more usually called. I also perform the role of the Deputy Keeper of the Records of Northern Ireland, as set out in the 1923 Public Records Act. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Martin Bradley, Deputy Lieutenant of Belfast. I extend a warm welcome to all those of you who have been to PRONI before, but especially welcome those visiting PRONI for the first time. Any first-time visitors in the room? Excellent, super, delighted. Thank you for coming. I hope it will be the first of many. PRONI is part of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and belongs to the Engaged Communities Group within the Department for Communities. The department has responsibility for the archives and records which we care for as the official archive for Northern Ireland, and which constitutes the community memory of all our citizens. Today's event is entitled On the Record, Reflections on the Belfast Agreement, and comprises a panel discussion to mark the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Agreement, offering a range of perspectives on official state records and personal accounts relating to the multi-party agreement and the British-Irish Agreement. This is a joint event organised by PRONI and our colleagues in the National Archives Ireland. I want to express my sincere thanks to the team at the National Archives. Today's event marks a number of notable firsts. It's the first time that PRONI and National Archives Ireland have held a joint event of this nature. It is also the first event in a programme that will take place over the next 12 months to mark the centenary of PRONI. We will be exactly 100 years old on the 22nd of June, or to be precise, our legislation was enacted 100 years ago on the 22nd of June, so this is the start of our centenary. I'm also delighted to announce that the original signed Belfast Good Friday Agreement is on display in the PRONI atrium. This is another first. It is the first time that the agreement has been on public display in Northern Ireland since it was signed. It is also the first time that the National Archives UK has loaned a document to PRONI. I want to acknowledge the support of the Northern Ireland office in facilitating the loan of the agreement and ensuring its return for the anniversary. So as you'll see, the original UK government signed copy of the agreement features the signatories of the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, the late Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam, and the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, David Andrews. There's about over 50 pages. You're only going to be able to see the signatories page, and it remains on display from today until the 12th of April. And I would encourage you all to take the opportunity to view this historic document and the other related PRONI records that are on display next door in the exhibition area. PRONI has a statutory duty to preserve the public record and make it available. Widening public access and supporting engagement are important archival activities. And that is why I want to mention a final collaborative partnership with Ulster University and the Conflict Archive on the Internet. Thousands of key documents from released PRONI public records dating from the 1960s to 1998 are freely available to view online via the CAN website. As we look back at our recent contested history, public records and archives offer a range of perspectives on the past. They do not provide the complete story, but can assist our understanding and help us to reflect on events, decisions, and our own recollections. I hope this afternoon's event will provide food for thought as we mark the 25th anniversary of the agreement. On behalf of the Public Record Office and the Department for Communities, I want to express my thanks to our panellists and to our chair today. And before I hand over to the speakers this afternoon, please may I check that your mobile phone is set to silent or switched off. That would be very much appreciated. Thank you. And there is no planned test of the fire alarm. So if the alarm does sound, we will have to evacuate. Please pray that that does not happen. PRONI staff will guide you to our assembly point across the Queen's Road. And I should highlight that following the presentation and the Q&A this afternoon, there will be a wine reception in the atrium, and you're all invited to join us for that reception. I am now delighted to introduce Orla McBride, the Director of the National Archives Ireland.
Thank you very much, David. Say how pleased I am to be here today. 25 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, this partnership event between the National Archives and the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is emblematic of the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, the positive and the constructive working together of bodies north and south. On this day, a quarter of a century ago, tensions were high in Stormont as they entered the final week of negotiations. And I have no doubt that David Donoghue will provide us with a very personal recollection of those final days and hours that led to what is undoubtedly a remarkable document, the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement. A document based on political leadership, vision, compromise, allowing us to break a cycle of violence on the island of Ireland that had continued for 30 years. The Good Friday Agreement was not only possible through groundbreaking leadership from across the traditions of the island, from the Irish and British governments, from our international partners, from civil society, and from ordinary people, all insisting on a peaceful, democratic future. So here we are, a generation on. The release of records in 2022 relating to the Good Friday Agreement under the National Archives Amendment Act of 2018 marked a significant moment in our shared understanding of the peace process and the years leading up to and including the signing of the agreement. We all recognise the rich benefits that derive for the people of Northern Ireland, as well as the enhanced North-South cooperation through the many North-South bodies established under the North-South Ministerial Council in areas such as tourism, arts, culture, language, education. The records we released under the 20-year rule relating to the Good Friday Agreement offer an invaluable insight into the politics and the people involved in Anglo-Irish affairs. Reflecting on these records and that time, our panel members will provide diverse perspectives on this time in our shared recent history. In the experienced hands of broadcaster, journalist, current affairs presenter Miriam O'Callaghan, we hope that the afternoon will be both challenging and thought-provoking for all who attend here in PRONI and for the many people that are registered online. So finally to say, the British copy of the Good Friday Agreement is here in PRONI, and the Irish government's copy of the Good Friday Agreement is on public display at the National Archives in Dublin, again to mark the 25th anniversary. And this panel discussion is presented as part of a series of events planned throughout 2023 to mark the 25th anniversary of the agreement. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Miriam O'Callaghan and to say how thrilled and genuinely honoured we are that she has come to chair today's discussions. There is no more expert a broadcaster than Miriam O'Callaghan to guide and deftly manage this afternoon's discussion. So I'm just really very pleased to hand over to Miriam for the rest of the afternoon. Well, thanks a million for that. Just to say, as I drove up from Dublin with my husband today, he drove me up because I got a flat tire talking like a 17-year-old school. I felt quite emotional because I do think events like this matter. Like, it's hard to believe it's 25 years ago since the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement was signed. It doesn't seem like 25 years. And at that time, having the privilege to cover that story, it's almost like we covered history. I'm acutely aware of that. And I do think it changed the lives of everyone on this island. I was explaining to my 17-year-old son as I dropped him this morning what I was doing, where I was going, and why it mattered. And he's a student of history. And he really got it. And I said, you know, love, you don't remember the nightly news where people were losing their lives. So when people talk about it being flawed and the assembly not being up and running, true, there are many problems with it. But the bottom line is that people are not being killed here on a daily basis. It is a different place. And I say that from a place of great emotion and a place of great happiness. And I'm married to a guy from Belfast, so it just suits me that it's all better anyway up here. And also, when I was thinking about my panel that Orla and David had constructed, sometimes you go to events like this, and let's be honest, there's a few boring people who are going to speak. But today, I just, today I just thought we have a stellar panel of people, all coming from different perspectives, all having been given access to some of these remarkable archives. And I, for one, am going to be riveted listening to them all. So the first up is the rather suave, Paul Weller looking Mr. Ron Patterson.
I would think somewhere somebody said it, Paul Howard. You look really I published a novel a couple of years ago. You wouldn't know this because it was just like when the pandemic was just starting. It came out with pretty much the same day they had the lockdown announced. But in it, there's a chapter, I think it might be set in this room, where a guy is standing at this lectern and he can't get it to move. He wants it to move, and then he pulls it really hard and he breaks a cable, and a century of memories are completely erased. The entire past is erased, and then the alarm that you were told isn't going to go off, it goes off, and that's when he discovers he has no trousers. So none of those things will happen. Leonard Woolf, the writer, used to write without his trousers, standing up. So it stopped him just kind of running out to Tesco's to get away from the desk. For reasons that might become apparent later, I hope they become apparent later, this is called One Stooge and Three Studios. At about 7:30 on one of the mornings leading up to Good Friday 1998, I was in the green room of the BBC on Ormeau Avenue with another guest, waiting for the call to go into the Good Morning Ulster studio. The talks up at Stormont were overrunning again. Generally, talks overrunning was good news for nobody except for novelists. The longer that talks overran, the more exhausted the political commentators got, and the less they actually had to comment on, the more chance there was that your little novelist's phone, which in those far off days, let us not forget, was still plugged into the wall out in the hall, the more chance there was that that would ring. I've already done several interviews since the formation 2 years before of the Northern Ireland Forum for Political Dialogue, from the bottom of the steps leading up to Parliament buildings. One of them, if memory serves, earlier that very Easter week. The question that was asked was always a variation on the same theme. What are the people on the street saying? I hadn't the heart, I hadn't the bank balance to say that as a novelist with a book to finish, just about the only time I got out onto the street was to go up to Stormont or down to Broadcasting House to answer that question. I think I would say every time that people just want to see a resolution. Shortly after 7:30 that Easter week morning, 1998, a researcher came into the green room and asked me to go through to the studio. I will never forget the look on Wendy Austin's face when she glanced up and saw me take my seat across the desk from her. The link that she was in the middle of delivering, the interview she was hoping to conduct, wasn't about what people on the street were thinking. It was about the legal and constitutional implications of some of the details leaking out from the talks. The researcher had brought the wrong person up from the green room. I saw some of those same appalled expressions on your face when you saw me stand up at the microphone here to give this talk, when there are four people, eminently more qualified than me to speak to the subject of the agreement that was finally announced late on the evening of Good Friday 1998, the snowy evening of Good Friday 1998. Be assured though that I will be offside soon enough. And you, like Wendy Austin, when Joshua Rosenberg, then Q, now KC, the BBC's legal affairs editor, was brought in, and I was smuggled out under the sound of the sports bulletin. But let me quickly fast forward 6 weeks from that April day to the 23rd of May. I was just leaving Broadcasting House. Again, that is, any of you who have ever been lost in its corridors wouldn't be at all surprised if that was finally leaving Broadcasting House, but I was leaving Broadcasting House again, morning of 23rd of May, when I ran into one of the other Good Morning Ulster presenters, Noel Thompson. The results of the referendum on the Good Friday Agreement had just been called. My memory is that I heard them first or I heard the first accurate prediction of them from Noel himself 71.12% in favour on an almost unprecedented 80+% turnout. I remember being giddy with elation. It felt as I stepped out onto Ormeau Avenue and turned towards the city centre like a Dick Van Dyke moment. You wouldn't have been surprised, or at least I wouldn't have been, if at a distant shout of action, every person in the street had burst into song, or if 7 out of 10 of them had anyway. Ian Paisley's claim that he had won a majority of the unionist vote sounded not just mathematically dubious, but politically desperate. For the second time in a month and a half, the DUP looked like yesterday's women and overwhelmingly men. As for the agreement itself, in truth, I remember more discussion about whether the family on the cover of the document circulated to every home in Northern Ireland were staring at the sun coming up on a new day, or the sun slowly sinking, than about anything that was on the inside. We voted, for the most part, as people for the most part vote in all elections and referendums, on the headlines, or on the reports of the headlines, or on what we heard other people say about the reports on the headlines. There's a glorious moment in the final episode of Series 3 of Derry Girls, which captures this perfectly. Joe McCool, by Ian McElhenney, has read the introduction to the agreement alone 3 times and can't make head nor tail of it. The agreement, by the way, in that final episode of Derry Girls deserves its own IMDb credit. So often does it appear in shot. So Joe has read it. I read the introduction 3 times, double Dutch. He says, "Well," says Kathy Kira Clark in the role of his daughter Sarah, "according to Shauna Sharkey, if you vote yes, you're allowed to swing both ways. You can be Irish, or you can be British, or you can be bi." Fast forward again to June 1998, the eve of the elections to the first Northern Ireland Power Sharing Assembly, the first Power Sharing Assembly since 1974. I think we need always add, and we need always to remember again, Seamus Mallon and his mordant verdict on the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners. June 1998, I was in London for the recording of the pilot of a new, and as it turned out, extremely short-lived current affairs programme called Zeitgeist, co-presented by Trevor Beattie and Jonathan Friedland. You can tell it was 1998 because broadcasters still thought it was a good idea to have 2 male co-presenters. The format, as I recall, was a series of specially commissioned film reports that would inform the studio discussion between presenters and the panel of reporters. By the way, that's the 3rd studio, in case you were counting. And I did call this 1 Stooge and 3 Studios in memory of my dad, who was a fan of a certain vintage of slapstick film. By now, June 1998, I think some of the smaller print of the Good Friday Agreement had come into greater focus, or the implications had just had a little bit more time to sink in. The question of designation already looked like it might be something that could, in the future, vex. I called my 1998 Zeitgeist report Significant Others, and noted that in the last survey of national identity conducted here, that was in 1998, 16% of people opted for the term Northern Irish before Irish, pure and simple, or British. That is, I went on, roughly the same number as voted Sinn Féin or the Democratic Unionist Party in the elections to the talks process. A reference again to that 1996 Northern Ireland Forum for Political Dialogue, in the elections to which Sinn Féin polled 15.5% and the DUP 18.8%. One thing you might say, looking over the recently released archives, is that an awful lot of attention was being paid to a party supported by 1 in 6 of the population. You might think that's a good thing. You might think that's not so good thing, but it's definitely a thing. As for the party supported by slightly under 1 in 5 of the population, they, by 1998, weren't there at all. 25 years on, they're not there again. Their vote share, which had risen almost to 30%, having slumped in the most recent election to just 3% above where it was in 1998. Though, to say again, if the archive shows nothing else, it shows that influence or importance seems not in the eyes of governments south of the border, across the water, and way across the other water, to be dictated by votes alone. The title of that Zeitgeist report, as I say, was Significant Others, but I actually had thought to call it Paddy Devlin's Fence, after a story I'd heard about Paddy Devlin, the capital L in SDLP, along with Jerry Fitt. A story I'd heard about Paddy Devlin being barracked by a crowd, one of whose number shouted at him, "Paddy Devlin, you need to come down off your fence and pick a side," to which Paddy shouted back, "No, you need to get up here on my fence with me." My report concluded with the line, "Like it or not, we are different from the other parts of the United Kingdom, Republic of Ireland, and it is no small part the experiences we have all lived through, Catholic and Protestant, nationalists and unionists, that sets us apart and makes us more like one another than many find it convenient or palatable to admit." I haven't seen Jonathan Freedland on TV much in recent years, but I hear him often on the radio and read him always with interest in Saturday Guardian. Saturday just gone, he deftly segued in his column from Gwyneth Paltrow's recent court case over a 2016 skiing accident to her movie Sliding Doors, which, delightful coincidence this, was released in 1998, and which, Friedland reminded readers, had given us a new phrase and image for those moments in life, but also in international politics, when things might have gone either way. Friedland contrasted Northern Ireland, 1998, opportunity for peaceful change seized, with Israel, 1998, opportunity for peaceful change missed. One got on the right train, he writes, and the other missed it. He does acknowledge that not everything in Northern Ireland is rosy, that people here still have much to contend with. It's usual now for people to qualify the achievement of Good Friday 1998. Tony Blair, interviewed on The World this weekend, just yesterday, used both the terms by and large and for the most part in reference to peace holding here. It's better than it was and better than it would have been without it, is the implication. I don't want at all to appear churlish, but the choice, to my mind, in 1998 wasn't between worst and a bit better than worst, but between worst and best. Rather than sliding doors, it's felt at times as though politics here is stuck in a revolving door, which occasionally in its revolutions affords us a glimpse of the truly transformed society, free from all residual trace of paramilitarism and sectarianism, and occasionally offers us a grimmer prospect of renewed conflict. My friend and co-writer Colin Carberry, reaching for an analogy for the agreement and its aftermath, when I was talking to him just yesterday, settled on a Coke bottle that has been shaken and shaken and shaken and shaken, and then you twist the cap and whoosh, we'll call them whoosh, the referendum, after which, well, it's all a wee bit flat. No one, I suspect, is going to organise a fortnight of events to mark the 25th anniversary of the St Andrews Agreement, although it, more than the Good Friday, informs the operation of our institutions. It's perhaps telling as we approach the 25th Good Friday since the agreement that among the works by writers from here currently and deservedly grabbing the attention are Blue Lights by Declan Long and Adam Patterson on BBC One, and close to home, brilliant debut novel by Michael McGee, which will be launched on Thursday. Ulster Sports Club, 7:30. Don't miss it. Both works depict a society transformed, certainly, unrecognisable from 1998, indeed, but one in which certain Troubles era tropes and the conditions with which they were intimately, complicatedly entwined persist. These are works in which the past does not, in a sense, exist in a closed-off time, which we might or might not return to, but as part of, in narrative terms, the continuous presence, part of the flow. To quote from the record by Run DMC and Jason Nevins that spent 6 weeks at #1 in the spring of 1998, it's like that, and that's the way it is, which isn't a recommendation to do nothing or give up trying. It's like that is, among many other brilliant things, a call to abandon prejudice, to educate yourself, and to seize opportunity. Which brings us back to Easter 1998. I said earlier I had been expecting, when I left the BBC on the day that the referendum results were announced, I've been expecting a Dick Van Dyke moment. But I had to wait 24 years for something like it. I finally got it in that final episode I mentioned earlier of Derry Girls, which in terms of celebrating the 25th anniversary, got there before everybody by coming out the 24th anniversary this time last year. Move over to Dick Van Dyke. This is the Orla McCool moment. If you haven't watched the final episode of Derry Girls, or you only watched it when it came out last April, do yourselves a favour, go home and look again to recapture that moment and that feeling of possibility and opportunity. The moment when Orla, played by Louise Harland, comes out of the hall where she's just registered to vote in the referendum and dances through the walled city to Dario G's glorious Sunshine. It is a recapturing of that moment, of that possibility, when we were still shaking the Coke bottle. And maybe we just the next time left the lid off a little more slowly.
Thank you so much for that, Glenn. Right from Lebanon, no wonder you write it. And you also, of course, our next speaker this morning will give us an historian's view in the archives. Miriam O'Callaghan, of course, she's Professor of 20th Century Irish History and Head of History at Queen's. She lived in Dublin in the Republic, actually, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. So she'll give that interesting historian's perspective of being somewhere else other than in the north at that time. Also teaching university students. She'll have a strong perspective on how they feel. And she's also advised a number of public bodies on historical commemorations. And in 2021, Marie, you were a member of the Northern Ireland Office's Centenary Historical Advisory Panel. Ladies and gentlemen, Marie O'Callaghan.
I think that last job was Centenary Historical Advisory Panel purely because we got an email one day from the British Embassy in Ireland asking when the chaps available to give a talk on Centenary Historical Advisory Panel. So I decided it was well worth doing that just to be one of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland's chaps. So as Miriam said, I want to just begin briefly with a reflection on where I was in 1998 as somebody living in the South, not thinking that my future and the future of my children lay here in Northern Ireland. 1998 was a hugely important year. I was the same age then as the Good Friday Agreement is now. I was finally finishing my education, finishing my PhD. I got my first job. It is possible for history students to get jobs. And I also got married. So amid all of those very busy things that I was doing on Easter weekend, 1998, checking to make sure all the footnotes were in the right place and said the right thing. At the last minute, realizing that with 3 months to go to the wedding, I have to actually go to the photographer, going through what was known then as the in the south of Ireland, the golden pages. Looking for a photographer, we did get one. I have to say, but I think what I wanted to get across was that I do remember that weekend. There's huge lot of other things going on in my life personally, but I remember distinctly, is this going to be a Spy Wednesday agreement? Is this going to be the Holy Thursday agreement? And finally we got as far as the Good Friday agreement. You see, when you had your Catholic upbringing, you knew all these dates in Holy Week, so you knew what you were going to call it. The point I want to get across, though, is for those of us living in the South, and I think Miriam and David and Amanda would probably agree on this. Yes, we weren't affected by the Troubles to the same extent. It didn't impinge on our lives as it did on the lives of people here, but it mattered. The Good Friday Agreement mattered a huge amount to those of us living in the Republic at the time, even if we didn't have links to the North. And I think sometimes Northerners think we were insulated from it, and it doesn't. Those of you in the South don't understand it, and probably we don't. But my main point is Good Friday really mattered to us in the South. And one of the most important votes I cast was in the Southern referendum. Glenn spoke there about the Northern one. Looking back as a citizen, I would always say one of the most important votes I ever cast was in that referendum. So that's my brief retrospective, but you don't want to hear what I was up to in 1998. I want to offer, I suppose, now the professional historian's view on it, and I want to thank the staff and the two archives here for identifying a number of key documents from their own collections on 1998. And one that attracted my eye in particular was one of David's memorandum that he produced, and the date of it, I was looking at it again this morning, the date is the 9th of April. 1998. And in the state papers released by the National Archives this year, there's a wonderful set of daily accounts of the talks which David prepared, which led to him earning the nickname in the Northern Ireland office of the Daily Donoghue. Well, the Daily Donoghue edition for the 9th of April 1998 is it really catches a moment in time. And there's discussions about decommissioning, and there's discussions about cross-border bodies and all things. And the last line just says, well, we finished the meeting and we went off to Castle Buildings. The meeting was held at Hillsborough. And it's just kind of, I can almost see the mental ... to be continued, because of course they went off to Castle Buildings, and we know they talked through the night and what happened from that. But what struck me, I think, about that memorandum of David's and his other accounts of the talks as they progressed during March and April 1998 is very much new about the Good Friday Agreement. We hear about these strands. Strand 1, power sharing. Glenn got ahead of me because I was also going to mention Seamus Mallon's comment about being Sunningdale for slow learners. That showed that the Strand 1, which was about power sharing within Northern Ireland, it had been tried before. So it wasn't something new that they had come up with in 1998, but of course it had failed. But I think the crucial point is that the idea wasn't new. If Sunningdale achieved anything, it was to show that whatever solution emerged, power sharing was going to be the basis of that. Once the British prorogued Stormont in 1972, their plan was always to restore government, but not to go back to Stormont pre-1972. There was always going to be some form of power sharing. Other issues relating to the internal issues of Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement was going to try to solve, but I think wisely didn't go into too much detail on, were obviously decommissioning, and I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because we would be here all day if I did, but possibly in discussions at the end we could mention it. But one that stands out again is policing reform. And I think I heard the interview with Jerry Adams on the BBC during the week saying, well, we kicked that to touch because we knew it was touchy for the unionists. Going back to David's memorandum, he notes that Tony Blair understood that unionists wanted some recognition of the people in the RUC who had died, but Martin Manser from the Irish government side countered that, well, while the pain and suffering could be acknowledged, any warm tribute to the RUC would not be sustainable for Sinn Féin. So we knew policing was going to be tricky, but again, reform of policing was not a new idea. The old RIC had to be disbanded in 1922 because it just wasn't acceptable to keep it going. And likewise in 1970, when there were efforts to resolve the early troubles, the B specials were gotten rid of. So a lot of what's in Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement isn't new. There is a historical background to it. Strand 1, sorry. Strand 2, if anything, is the least new idea, the north-south bodies, and the one which I think David probably had a lot of sleepless nights over. The idea of some sort of cross-border bodies, there have been plans for a Council of Ireland in the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. That name, probably not a very good idea to reuse that name again in Sunningdale in 1972. If it was the oldest idea in the Good Friday Agreement, that the Strand 2 idea of some north-south cooperation, it was the most controversial. Mitchell's draft prepared on Palm Sunday, see there's the old religious upbringing coming in there again. The Sunday before Holy Week, Mitchell's draft, it was the Strand 2 which nearly downed the agreement in Holy Week. The Unionists, when they saw the number of cross-border bodies, the fears that they might have executive authority, they saw unity by stealth. This was the rerunning of the Boundary Commission in the Anglo-Irish Treaty. It was the Declaration of the Republic in 1949. It was Dublin just being a Sunningdale away, as it was in 1974. It was the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. And if anybody understood that, it was David Trimble. David Trimble in 1998 was Brian Faulkner in 1974. But having been one of Brian Faulkner's thorns in Brian Faulkner's side in 1974, he understood that he needed to do better than Faulkner. You have to ask yourself the question, though, why did the Irish government then come up with this big long list of things if everybody knew Unionists would have a problem? And I think the answer is that Unionists weren't the only ones who had learned lessons from Sunningdale. Nationalists were wary of these cross-border bodies being subject purely to the Northern Ireland Assembly, because as they saw it, the Unionists would bring Sunningdale down, bring the Good Friday Agreement down as they had brought down Sunningdale if there weren't some outside bodies running these. From the nationalist perspective, Strand 2 had to have some powers independent of the assembly. I think a lot of those concerns, those fears from both sides, we're seeing them today with the framework agreement, whether you accept these views or not. But I think there's an element within nationalism thinks that certain unionist parties don't want to share power with, certainly with the nationalist majority. And on the other hand, there is a sense maybe within unionism that this time around it's the Windsor Dublin is just a Windsor framework away and not a Sunningdale away. I'm coming up with my 10 minutes. I have lots of other things to say, but I want to go on to the last point of looking forward. So I've looked back, I've taken the historian's perspective. I want to look forwards. And I think about my students in Queen's, who I brought them to the Ulster Museum before Christmas, and we looked at the Troubles exhibition, and they came back to the class after and said, what was the Women's Coalition? And it's apart from me feeling very old, it was a revelation. And I saw it again this morning. I saw a statistic in the paper that something like 600,000 people in Northern Ireland born after the Good Friday Agreement. So I think it is important that we explain the significance of it. Now, how we do it, I don't know, because it is not taught nearly well enough in our curriculum. I saw something yesterday about in the south of Ireland, a quarter of young people don't know what the Troubles are. It's also missing from the history curriculum. But one thing I do want to, I'll leave you on this final thought. Yes, things are a lot better here than they were in 1998, but we have a bit of a tendency to fall back on that and to tell young people who have genuine concerns about jobs and housing and whatever else. There is a bit of a tendency, and we have to avoid getting into it, of saying, look, these are grand, it could be worse. Think how bad it was in 1998. They weren't alive then. Most of my students are now being born after the St. Andrews Agreement. That's how old I am. So I think looking forward, while yes, we have to get across to that generation how significant 1998 and onwards has been, I think we have to avoid the platitudes of saying, sure, you're grand, because it was all better now. It's better now than it was then. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Marie. Super, really interesting. Next up, it's always worth having someone who was in the room at the time. And our next speaker is that he's also one of the most modest diplomats I've ever met. He's worked in Northern Ireland peace, Anglo-Irish relations for almost 25 years. He's a fount of information. His new book he wrote, One Good Day, had the privilege of interviewing him about recently. He was in those negotiations working on behalf of the Irish government. He knows exactly what happened. Give a warm welcome to Dave Dunham.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you very much. First to PRONI and also to the National Archive. It's a fantastic initiative to release records from both sides, really, for that particularly eventful period. I must say that the reference earlier on to the signed copy of the agreement, even that, it just brings back to me how chaotic and how completely unpredictable the last few days 25 years ago were, because as you, I'm sure all know, there was no signed agreement in the strict sense of parties sitting down and formally signing it for a very simple reason. Two parties needed to secure approval from their, I'll phrase it carefully, from their wider supporters, and therefore, in particular, DUP and sorry, Freudian slip, the UUP and Sinn Féin were not in a position to sign. Therefore, it fell to a couple of the other leaders on Good Friday to say more or less, well, we can't really have a photograph, but let's at least sign a copy of the agreement to show we were here, sort of thing. So that's why there were a small number of copies of the agreement which had not all of the signatures, but just a few of them. And it's great that 25 years later, efforts should be made to bring it over from the UK archive. So, but it brings back to me really how hectic and chaotic it was at the very end. I must say, Marie's analysis, I absolutely agree with it. It's a terrific understanding of what we were trying to do. One thing I was amused, though, from what she said, was that if I was known for daily reports on the way the talks were going, those reports were, strictly speaking, for my own government. If the Northern Ireland office should have called them the Daily Donoghue, that implies that a degree of electronic surveillance, which I suppose we knew probably existed at the time. But I'm just amused, if the Irish government had spoken about the Daily Donoghue, that would make sense. But let's just say nobody else was supposed to be seeing what was going on. That said, in those particular memorandums or reports to which Marie referred, I wasn't giving away anything particularly startling. Perhaps it's worth just giving a broad idea of what kind of records were generated throughout that period. Some of them would be literally minutes or accounts of meetings. And there was a rather amusing distinction between the British system and the Irish system of reporting, as I gradually discovered. In the British system, I should explain that the particular reason I discovered this was because I was the Irish head of the Anglo-Irish Secretariat here in Belfast, specifically the Maryfield Secretariat, and therefore I was living cheek by jowl with British colleagues who were reporting on their conversations with me and or with others, or with on joint conversations. And every now and again, I would accidentally come across a British account of the same of the meeting I thought I'd been at, and that was actually quite funny because it would turn out that, I mean, here I'm just giving a parody, but let's imagine that it was a meeting with Mo Mowlam or something. That the British report would begin something like, there would be a little evaluation at the beginning, excellent discussion with the Secretary of State. Our Irish colleagues were exposed for the shallowness of their arguments. I mean, this is a parody. The Secretary of State played a blinder, etc. So the thing is that this evaluative approach was allowed in the British system, almost encouraged. In the Irish system, it was extreme, it was absolutely discouraged. So you knew from years previously that you would be consigned to outer darkness, to the most unpleasant posting if you were to right above your station. If you were, so you were expected to record a meeting basically as it happened, without a scintilla of subjective comment. So I was just amused by the contrast that I almost wanted to see what my British colleagues had made of the same session. But let me just try and give you a flavour of that final week, since we're here, or we are in some ways retracing those steps. It really went quite differently from the way we had imagined. We, I think, sensed that there was going to be a big dust-up with the Unionists over, as Mary was describing, over the Strand 2 arrangements. What we didn't expect was that this dust-up would last for almost the entire week. Now, we didn't know that there was going to be a week of negotiations. And what had happened was that it was understood that Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern would come for the finale. They would come more or less to smile at everybody, give a joint press conference, and in effect just usher the agreement over the line. It was not expected that we would actually need prime ministerial time to get the agreement over the line, and it certainly was never expected that we would need 3 days of prime ministerial time. It was tricky for them because, you know, they had to invest a fair amount of political capital. They would have looked sheepish, frankly, had they spent 3 days in castle buildings and had nothing to show for their efforts at the end of it all. So there was undoubtedly a degree of risk. But it meant that the week began with us finding that the Unionists were reacting very badly to what's called the Mitchell draft. That's to say, a single draft of the overall agreement, which formally was presented by Mitchell, but which in effect the two governments had already agreed among themselves. This Mitchell draft put the cat among the pigeons. You all know this. The Unionists were very unhappy at the Strand 2 arrangements which were proposed, and therefore we had to spend a certain amount of time adjusting our position, rolling back, deciding that we could compromise on this and so on. What it meant was that because Strand 2 was the focus for about 2 days that week, there was very little time left over for anything else. I mean, we did have time for some other issues, but not as much time as might have been expected. Why was that? Because George Mitchell had made clear that he wanted the Holy Thursday deadline, the 9th of April. He wanted that to be strictly adhered to. Now, this was a deadline which the two governments had basically come up with in consultation with George Mitchell. I mean, it was felt that we had to really fix a deadline. But Mitchell added a nice dose of sort of emotional blackmail, because at the beginning of the week, he said basically, and you'll have heard this before, he said that, you know, I have a wife and a young child in New York, and I've hardly seen my son Andrew since I've been over here with you guys. And now I'm going back to New York at the weekend, and I'm not coming back. Now, he could have been bluffing, or it could have been sincerely meant. He said this with a smile, but everybody interpreted that as meaning it probably wouldn't be coming back, and who would blame him? So it meant that we knew that we effectively had to get an agreement through by Easter. There was no, and there was also a sense that while we might slip on Thursday, we could go into Friday, but there would be no question of going over the weekend. The momentum would be gone. So in effect, if we didn't make it on the Friday, it'll be all off for about 5 years. That was my own view. So that really meant that de facto there was a deadline. And therefore, if you think in terms of the Strand 2 discussions, which were only really resolved at midnight on the Thursday, going into Friday, it meant that there was effectively only the rest of the night and a little bit of Friday to handle everything else. So, as is well known, we got through Strand, we got the deal in Strand 2 around midnight. We then had the deal in Strand 1 within about 2 hours, which everybody had expected, to be honest. They saw a link. It was assumed that strand 1 would fall into place after strand 2 had been agreed. Then strand 3 was relatively straightforward. Then we have the prisoner issue, which was sensitive, but was being handled in effect by the 2 prime ministers. That brought us to the early hours of Good Friday, when we all really did feel that the moment had come, and there was a real sense of waking up to a new world. And it's one of these things, I think, for everybody who was there, and I include very much the unfortunate media who were outside in the miserable conditions, including Miriam and many others. For everybody, it was a pretty grim experience, whether you were inside the building or not. But we really did feel on that morning that the moment had come. Then there was the well-known crisis within the UUP, and I, for one, thought by lunchtime that it was all over again. I honestly thought that David Trimble wouldn't be able to put out the fire within his own party. Come the early afternoon, we were thinking, this is it, we'll pack up our bags, forget about the talks. Then, to my utter amazement, around 4 o'clock, Mitchell rings around and says, well, you won't believe this, but I've just had David Trimble in my room, and he says he's ready to go for the agreement. And although Trimble had, and I'm not saying anything new here, he had tested the patience of both governments on many occasions, at the same time, we did recognise clearly the courage he showed at 2 or 3 key moments. He wasn't the only one showing courage, but he certainly was one of the more important people showing courage, and that was one of them. He obviously had a letter from Tony Blair which helped, but he was basically deciding the fork in the road had come. He was going to go one way, and he went the right way, and we then had the agreement. So you can see from that it was a kind of a topsy-turvy week. Nobody could have foreseen the end of it. At lunchtime on that Friday, I, for one, thought, and I'd been involved for many years beforehand, I thought it was all over. So that, in that sense, there was a touch of the miraculous about it. Of course, in the meantime, it hasn't been quite such a miracle, and Glenn, I think, captured that very, very well, especially when he, in his final remarks about let us not release the air quite so suddenly from the Coke bottle in future. I know exactly what he means. There has been some disappointment, some disillusionment, but it's still, I think, the only way to go. In my view, the Good Friday Agreement is the right approach. It just has never been given a chance. A final word really about the documents, about the archives. I really think that it is fantastic that this initiative has been taken by the 2 archives, North and South. There's a lot in, dare I say it's one of the authors, but there's a lot in the documents which have been released on both sides of the border. It is, for me, fascinating to see some of the stuff. I mean, I knew it at the time. I'd forgotten it. I haven't looked at those articles or I should say reports in 25 years. But it reminds me of the diversity of what we were dealing with. You'd have a conversation about orange parades with the chief constable one moment. Another moment you're talking about flags and emblems. Another moment you have a row between 2 prime ministers. At another moment you have great bonhomie between 2 prime ministers. That's clear if you read the accounts of the conversations between John Bruton and John Major on the one hand, and Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair on the other. You had a huge discrepancy or contrast, let's say, between Paddy Mayhew as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the person who followed him, whom he kindly referred to as a good egg when I met him. So looking back, it brings back to me just the richness of the issues, or let's say the size of the challenges, but also at the end of the day, we somehow collectively did manage to find a way forward, and so it is. I congratulate the National Archive and PRONI once again on what they've done, and I hope that they'll do more of this, because it really is a fantastic public service. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have the writer.
the historian, the diplomat, and now it's the artist. I probably hardly need to introduce Amanda Dunsworth. Her work is quite extraordinary. She's one of the most talented artists working on this island. She's going to come up now and talk about some of her works, societal transformation, and the context of the agreement. Amanda.
Thank you very much, the National Archives of Ireland, and for the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland for inviting me here today. I'm going to talk about the Keeper Archive, and all this work comes under the title of the Keeper, and it has artworks, objects, and documents. And today I'm going to talk about the artworks. I was artist in residence in the Maze prison from 1997 to 98. And I was working with the Republican Loyalist prisoners. And I was working on a piece of work called Time Trap, which involved that I had to bring in a lot of different types of equipment which hadn't been allowed into the prison before. So I got to know the prison officers very well. And I got to know one particular prison officer called Billy Hull very well. And Billy Hull was one of the senior prison officers. He was actually sat with the hunger strikers and also was the person involved when anything happened within the prison. So if there was a tunnel or a killing, or they found some documents that were needed to be used by the army, they were sent out of the prison. They were sent to the NIO, to the army, to the courts, and then after a couple of years they would be redundant and they would be sent back to prison. And prison policy was to destroy. The individual who was supposed to destroy them was Billy Hull. Billy Hull was also an amateur historian, and he recognized he was living lived history, and he didn't destroy them, and he hid them. And he hid them in the Longkesh compound for 15 years at the height of the Troubles. Time passed, and after a while, the prison is beginning to wind down, perhaps. There's a new governor, Governor Steve Davis, and Billy goes to Governor Steve Davis and tells him what he's done. The governor gives him time off from his duties and allows him to collate and gather the objects. And he put on a display in the old laundry building inside the maze. So it was a display that was not open to the public. And then Billy would give tours to individuals around. I happened to be in on one of those tours on one of those days with a camera, and I documented Billy giving the talk, and I documented the artifacts. Billy's action and his act of repeated saving of these artifacts and being in lived history greatly influenced me as an individual, as an artist. And it took a while for me to process this. And these types of engagements take a while to process. As an individual and society, we need time. But I made a piece of work called Billy's Museum, which was based upon these artifacts. We're going to come back to the artifacts later on. His act of recognizing what he was living, and at that time, I must say, you can hear I'm English, but I went to college in York Street in the late 80s, and I lived in Belfast at that time. I was here for the talks, etc. And I understood the impact, perhaps, of what was going on. And as an artist, I felt, what could I do? So I began to reach out to the people who post the Good Friday Agreement. So starting about 2003, 2004, and see if they would be filmed for a series of portraits. And portraits are all 20 minutes. They are all silent. They are all 4:3. And all of them have a visual parody of this red curtain behind them. When I filmed John Hume in 2005, I recognized actually that there was, with the exhibition, I held these portraits back from exhibition immediately. And the reason being is, as I understood, because I was living in Northern Ireland, that society sometimes needs a lot of time to process things. We're at a 25-year point. We're built to process things in the sort of based on our lifetimes. So you have a point of 25 years, 50, the reflection, and then 100, which is that very interesting point, which is normally within the human lifespan. Come back to again to the time in a minute. When I filmed John Hume's portrait, I held it back for exhibition for 13 years until I could film David Trimble's portrait. And the reason being is that I needed that visual parity of the two individuals in the representation. Also, what these individuals had done, or when I was living in Northern Ireland, we were imparted with lots of information. There was lots of information coming from politicians. We believed that we understood these individuals, but communication is based upon my talking and you listening. There's another half of that communication, which all societies are built on, and that is listening, that is silence. So the portraits are silent to allow the audience to have the time to reflect, but also to have a deeper understanding of these individuals. And the reason to have a deeper understanding is that these individuals brought something that was quite astounding. For me, it was very important to represent the women who were in this room as well. And when I filmed Monica Williams, and actually she is the only portrait that I've filmed twice, there are only one take. But when I filmed her in 2004, I asked to film her again in 2019 because there was a technical issue. And luckily I was able to film Pearl Seegers of the Women's Coalition as well. Seamus Mallon was a very interesting portrait film, and I don't actually have time to go into the wonderful dialogues that were going on with myself and his daughter Orla, and then over the years. But actually, I have created a body of work that's a reflection upon that process as well, which I'll show later on. Bertie Ahern, Gary McMichael, Jerry Adams. I'm sorry, I didn't name the individuals earlier on. I've been talking too much. And then Malky Curran from Northern Irish Labour Party. So there are 14 portraits. I've shown you 13. The 14th is of Mo Mowlam. When I filmed Mark McGuinness, Mo Mowlam passed away that morning. Mo Mowlam was also, for me, the inspiration for this body of work. I was in the Maze prison when she visited the Loyalist prisoners. And I was leaving the, excuse me. I was being escorted out the airlock by the OC of the Loyalist prisoners. And he said, sure, all the women are in this week, Mother. And he's referred to Mo. And again, it didn't immediately percolate to make this body of work, but her influence upon the whole talks process and her being in Northern Ireland, it was very important for me to visually represent her. So I'm making a piece that is based upon RTE archive footage. It's based upon 30 years of footage. And then I'm making a mapping piece using an actor. So she will be represented as well as all of the individuals that I've been filmed. And I've just finished that piece. I'm going to come back quickly then to these artifacts, because every time I exhibited Billy's museum, people would ask me, where are the artifacts? And I found them 6 years ago, and they were in the Mull Isle Training Centre of the prison officers. And they were in an attic, and they were being minded by another prison officer, who was another amateur historian, who recognised that these objects, some of which were beginning to decay, he was looking after them. He also introduced me to the photographic records of the prisons, and he introduced me to this body of work that he was concerned because the Mull Isle was going to be closed down, and he was concerned for these glass plate negatives. So I went through 3,000 of them, and we selected about 300, which he gave to me, and then I took them away, and I made a piece of work. And the reasoning that, of that is that notion coming back again to the reflective. So these all were taken 100 years ago. And when you pare them down to take them just to the face, we can see them just as individuals and not as prisoners. And also these individuals knew Ireland as we do not. because they're all pre-partition. So I created this piece, which was shown at the 20th anniversary, actually, the agreement in the Hugh Lane. And I made a piece from these, which were 100 of them. And the piece is called 1899 to 1918. And actually, I'm just staying on this one because the prison officer who I worked with the second time said to me, that's a suffragette, which I think is lovely to see. So then they were presented as the 100. So there's that notion of being able as an audience to reflect back. We can equate ourselves much better with something that's 100 years ago than 25 years ago, because we are still living history. And we as societies need time and that reflection. But the role of the artist is to collate and to gather and to represent and to have that stored so that future generations can reflect. And here's a body of work, which I'm going to finish on now, which is my reflection upon the process of making those pieces of work. And Memento Agreement is based upon my journeys to meet the individuals. It's based upon my memories, which I've written, the stories of the encounters. And it's then based upon a drawing as well. And what's interesting with memory is that we have David made contemporaneous pieces of writing. They were immediately after the fact. But we as a society and we as individuals have, the longer you leave it, the different the memories are. And it's incredible how, as a society, as a group, a collection, that we reflect and things come up more and more. As an artist, I am attempting to act as a social documenter of this lived history and of individuals who embody societal change. Agreement is a civic artwork, which I've been compelled to make. The artwork is complete and my work is done. But what is unique about art, all art, that its life only starts when the artist's work is done. It can be a conduit for societal re-examination. It can act as the point of civic reflection for generations to come, and it can instigate dialogues of legacy and future legacies. All my artworks can be viewed as documents of a specific place, offering an additional perspective, another form of remembering, an acknowledgement of a presence and of a time preserved for a future context, right?
Well, Amanda, thanks so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much. I've never seen any of that before. Our final speaker of our fantastic panel members here is the journalist ivy, really, isn't it, Malachy? Malachy O'Doherty, many of you will know, is one of our finest journalists. He's also a writer of many books, including his latest, How to Fix Northern Ireland, published this month by Atlantis. And Malachy, I think you're going to talk about largely the importance, as Dave has spoken about, PRONI and the National Archives in terms of you writing your books. Please give a warm welcome to Malachy.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here amongst you. My most intensive use of National Archive and PRONI files was during lockdown, when I was working on this book, The Year of Chaos, which essentially is about 1972. Well, it is about the period between internment in 71 and Operation Motorman in July 72. And I accessed files from PRONI and National Archive through the Kane website, where a lot of material was available. My first big insight into the agreement, by looking back, was how far politicians had to move to complete it. I've heard from Marie that a lot of that movement was actually done even at Sunningdale. I read Irish government summaries of the big checkers summits between Heath, Faulkner and Lynch in September 1971. There, Heath tried hard to impress on Faulkner, Brian Faulkner, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland at the time, tried to impress on him the need to involve the SDLP in government.
Faulkner resisted this, but conceded that he might have Catholics on advisory committees. He didn't see any point in working closely with people whose aspiration was to have a united Ireland. Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach, was there to represent the views of the SDLP, though not to negotiate on their behalf. He could not commit them to ending their boycott of Stormont until internment was ended, and there was no suggestion that he spoke for or ever would want to speak for Sinn Féin. So none of these parties saw how far they would have to shift. But an underlying premise was that if the SDLP could be satisfied with a deal, then the Catholic support for the IRA would be undermined and stability might follow. There was no idea that Sinn Féin might expand and be a contender for seats in government at that time. The whole point of the slowly emerging idea of power sharing was that Sinn Féin might be sidelined. Heath and Lynch met first to clarify their positions to each other. Heath started off by saying that he wanted a full and free discussion and that he believed that the Irish had misunderstood what the British were trying to do in Northern Ireland. He said that the economy was being damaged. That would inevitably affect the economy of the Republic. Lives were being lost, and both countries were about to enter the EEC, as it was called then, together. Lynch said, "We would be in an intolerable position if we had to bring this present serious problem in with us." So Heath and Lynch were about to bring their countries into the European Common Market and wanted the troubles ended before then. That would have been by Christmas of 71. Optimistic thinking there. So they didn't want to be importing division between them into the European Forum. Well, this morning we have Arlene Foster complaining about the EU claiming some credit for peacemaking here. Undoubtedly, the context of EEC membership was a major change in the eyes of both British and Irish governments from the start. So that focus of my study reminded me how radical, indeed unthinkable, the agreement would have seemed to parties in the worst year of the Troubles. Set against that, it is clearly a highly creative and brave step. There's a sharp difference between the positions taken by the Irish government then and during the peace process of the 1990s. Lynch said that partition was the root cause of violence because it required that efforts had to be made to keep the Unionists in power. He said that 1/3 of the population of the North wanted a united Ireland. Everybody in the Republic also wanted a united Ireland, and most wanted it to be brought about peacefully. Lynch described the IRA as a byproduct of the situation and asked Heath to state clearly that the unification of Ireland would have to be the ultimate solution and to promise to work towards that, saying this would be enormously helpful. The Irish position was that Britain should become a persuader for Irish unity. They grew more confident of asserting that argument after direct rule in 1972. An advisory paper compiled for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin set out the reasoning behind this. The paper was called Towards a General Settlement and was marked secret. It's lovely when you go through documents and you see top secret. You really feel like you're getting into things. You know? They're not always that very interesting either. The paper contests the British claim. That's the paper Towards a General Settlement, an advisory paper for the Irish government. The paper contests the British claim that Ireland could not be united without the consent of a majority in the North. So the consent principle was rejected by high-level advice to the Irish government in 1972. Cardinal Conway, the Primate of all Ireland, had said that the IRA was wrong to think it could bomb 1 million Protestants into a united Ireland. The paper reviewed that statement as unfortunate because it assumes that all Protestants in Northern Ireland are against the idea of a united Ireland. However, at this stage, the Irish were working on the parallel assumption that all Northern Catholics did want a united Ireland. The paper said the Taoiseach said that the Taoiseach should now assert that Irish policy was to change the constitutional status of Northern Ireland altogether. It said that is not conquest, not assimilation, not victory. It is a constitutional reform which history imposes on the country as a whole, right? This is very close to Irish government thinking in 1972. The first application of that strategy came when the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Patrick Hillery, a future Irish president, met with the new Northern Ireland Secretary of State, William Whitelaw, at the end of April 1972. He practically badgered Whitelaw into accepting that the ultimate goal of his new political initiative must be a united Ireland. Perhaps Ireland was emboldened by the fact that two recent former prime ministers, Harold Wilson and Alec Douglas-Hume, were both arguing strongly for Irish unity at that time. That idea of Britain as a persuader for unity was a key demand of Sinn Féin's at the start of the Good Friday talks, and Britain still resisted it. 1972 gave us the first peace process, though the term wasn't used then. IRA leaders Gerry Adams and Daithí O'Connell met with British diplomats Frank Steele and Philip Woodfield to prepare the way for a meeting between the Army Council and the Secretary of State in London. We can read Woodfield's account of that meeting and see how each side tried to play the other, and from their efforts, we can infer what their objectives were. Here we find several elements of peace processing that worried people in the later peace process of the 1990s. The ambiguity, were the IRA given permission to carry guns for their own protection during the ceasefire? They understood that they were. The British side was vague, saying that there would be no need for them to carry guns if there was no trouble. The ceasefire itself was understood by the British to be holding, even when the IRA and loyalists were killing civilians. More people were actually killed during the 2 weeks of the July 72 ceasefire than in the 2 weeks before it. Let that sink in. And we can see how statements from this by the Secretary of State were edited and re-edited to obfuscate on the question of whether the Special Powers Act would be suspended for the duration of the ceasefire, because on the documents we can see the Tipex marks and the penned amendments. The core objective of the peace process, as stated last week by Gerry Adams in an interview with Mark Simpson, was to find an alternative way forward for Republicans seeking a united Ireland. The premise of that statement affirms the words of Michelle O'Neill recently, that there had been no alternative to an IRA campaign until the peace process. I don't think any other party to the process accepted that premise. But setting that declared objective against the methods deployed to achieve it raises doubts about its integrity. I, like some of the rest of you here, was in the centre of Belfast on Bloody Friday and took shelter as the bombs went off around us. The PRONI and NIA files carry the statements of politicians and others afterwards, appalled, saying over and over again that no political objective was served by such barbarism. On the loyalist side, we saw the increased killing of random Catholics random Catholics picked up walking home at night or taken from a car at a UDA checkpoint. What these researches lead to, for me, is a serious doubt that sovereignty concerns were in fact the main driver of violence. These paramilitary campaigns were infused with a degree of sectarian contempt. When the IRA committed itself to not shooting British soldiers, it shot Protestants instead. And this proved no obstacle to Whitelaw going ahead with his meeting with the IRA leadership. So when I reflect on the Good Friday Agreement, I ask if it misses the point, makes the sovereignty question central, and does too little to urge the merging of a divided society. Tony Blair said recently in an interview with Eamon Malley that the Good Friday Agreement, the problem in Northern Ireland is really quite simple. You know, you had two different views of the sovereignty of the place. All you had to do was find a compromise between them. So my next book considers how that misses the point very largely. But I have a footnote for the benefit of people who have PRONI in their hearts. The Irish government had set up an interdepartmental unit on the north of Ireland. This unit met to discuss ways of seeking increased cooperation with Northern Ireland, a region whose name the unit was averse to actually using, of course. The October 71 meeting discussed a proposal for joint cooperation from the Northern Ireland Public Records Office. The Irish detected excessive zeal from PRONI. This interdepartmental unit on the north of Ireland reported to the Irish government Business Records Committee of Archivists studying counties being split over how to proceed. The northern side had suggested, they were doing research a county at a time, essentially deep archival research. The northern side had suggested that Monaghan be dealt with next, and it offered to provide a full team for the studies there. But our own Public Record Office had a strong preference for Meath because the county librarian there was known to be more cooperative. It was a reminder that while armed groups were advancing their agendas or trying to through murder and sabotage, and while governments laboured to find a balance between political initiative and armed force, sometimes the prospects of cooperation between North and South hung not on high wire diplomacy like David's, on military strategy like Tom's, but on the genial nature of the county librarian. Division was real and trust was low. That was the problem. Thank you.
I'm just saying that there's a good job doing the question, and obviously the online person, I think they're going to.
First question.
Last moment in the
Yeah,
panel.
no.
And I
Yeah,
have
there is a man, a woman, a man. Great, I'm gonna give you a microphone if you don't mind. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go again.
Yeah, so first of all, just like to
I don't think it's working actually. Maybe just turn it on. I don't think these mics are working actually. No, that's fine. Just shout.
Okay,
Yeah.
first of all, obviously I'd like to thank the panel. It was all very diverse and interesting presentation. I was wondering, with David's talk, piece about the Donahue dailies and how if the British side are able to get their hands on them, was there different grades of information within the Irish side that the reason for the protocols in place to kind of stop stuff that they didn't want the other side to hear in place? Was it more casual?
Good question. Do you want to repeat? So in other words, you're basically saying, do they have protocols?
Is there protocols in place to protect by high-level information? Because I assume there's some stuff on the Irish side that, okay, British had it, we prefer if they didn't, it's not the end of the world.
Okay.
We wouldn't like to know, for example, what compromises we're willing to make in advance.
Okay, how were you able to stop yourself being spied on, in other words?
No, but
David,
the simple answer is no. But to be honest, it didn't bother us particularly. I mean, just to put this in perspective, I was in a building which was obviously controlled by the British government, and so you just simply made certain assumptions, and you worked around that. And in the book I published recently, to which Miriam kindly made reference, I actually mentioned at one point that we used to resort to all kinds of weird codes, like speaking in Irish or actually going outside and things like that. But no, I mean, to be honest, and joking apart, it didn't bother us that potentially our conversations might be picked up and even, I mean, we were roughly speaking working in the same direction, but it wouldn't stop people being curious about, say, contacts we had or whatever. You just, it's part of the turf, and it didn't really bother us. It would be amusing if from time to time I might hear something which I recognized faintly from something I had written maybe a few days earlier, and which could only have been picked up in one way. But amusement would be the motif rather than outrage.
great.
I just come in slightly on that. I'm not entirely sure where the Daily Donahue came from. I certainly get the sense that they were aware that you were making these daily accounts, but it's now on I'm going to call you the Daily Donahue.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, on that though, could be clever. Did you ever use it knowing you were being listened to drop something in that you wanted them to hear, but you knew wasn't really the case?
I think you should keep that.
We did occasionally. I mean, if we wanted a particular message to be delivered, we would often use that route, so if not to completely deceive the other side, but let's say to divert them for a couple of days, we wanted to emphasize, for example, how seriously the Taoiseach treated something. We might deliberately put a message to that effect down the wires and see what kind of reaction there would be. But to be honest, I'm being half lighthearted with all of this. I mean, we had to, from 1985 on, the British and Irish governments were actually meant to be working closely together under the logic of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and on the whole, we achieved that. There were times when relations were strained, and I'm not even talking about the period since Brexit, for which I have no responsibility. But even then, I mean, from the material, for example, which has been released by the two archives, it's all very, very interesting. But there's one account of conversation, a phone conversation between John Bruton and John Major, and ironically, there was probably. They maybe had more in common politically than you might imagine, but they were temperamentally not suited to each other. And so there was a certain amount of strain over that. Whereas, let's say, Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair kind of clicked as personalities. So, I mean, you got a lot of differences really in style between the two governments, but on the whole, we were heading in the same presumed direction. We would have problems, say, on issues like decommissioning of weapons with the Tory government in the 90s. It was easier with the Labour government, though not entirely. I mean, there was still some problems, but on the whole, the fact that we had worked out and we had agreed a number of documents together in the 90s, that was very important. It meant that we had a sort of a bedrock of common positions. So even if there were occasional irritations or turbulence in the relationship, we were heading in the same direction.
Okay, there's a lady just there. Thanks. I think the microphone's working now.
Thanks a million to all the panelists. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, probably a question more so for Marie and David, if all of these kind of issues had been raised previously, what was it about this particular week in 1998 that kind of brought about the agreement? Like, was it the momentum? Was it like productive negotiations, a desire for peace?
I had been going to go into that, but I just didn't have time. And I think I remember asking Seamus Fallon at one point, the one time I met him, I shared an event with him and your former colleague Noel Dorr on Sunningdale. And in Noel's book on Sunningdale, he raises the fact that Seamus never actually said who his slow learners were. So we put poor Seamus on the spot and asked him who his slow learners were, because it's often assumed that it's the Unionists. They wouldn't share power with the Nationalists, and it took them 25 years to learn. But he also made it quite clear he meant the men of violence. And the difference was that on both sides, they were inside the tent in 1998. I think I agree with Malachy. I looked at Arlene Foster's piece this morning and thought, right, well, a bit like Jim Shannon's piece last week, claiming that not everybody in the DUP was opposed to the Good Friday Agreement. The European dimension, I think, is important. And as you get that point, we're just about to go into it, but the international dimension is huge. You talked about not expecting to need prime ministerial intervention. I don't think you expected to be waking up poor President Clinton in the middle of the night and him being on the phone in the early hours of the 10th of April either. So I think the time wasn't right in 1974. Unionist opinion on things like policing reform, on sharing power, came a long way. The British government, Keir Starmer recently in Queen's talked about how great the Good Friday Agreement is and great achievement of the Labour government, and a few of us sitting there going, well, less said about the Labour government during the 1970s, the better. So British government had changed. I think everyone had come along. They just weren't ready for it in 74. They were, they had 3,500 good reasons why they were more ready for it in 1998.
Yeah.
I just always assumed Sunningdale for slow learners referred to Sinn Féin. I just did. I just always thought that's what it was, because I mean, in Sunningdale or in the power sharing government in 1973-4, the Unionists were there, and it was the Unionist Party. I mean, that's a good God. I didn't know all this time what I was saying.
Well, the Workers' Council as well, I think there's a lot, but Seamus made it quite clear. It applied to a wide range of people other than Sinn Féin. But yes, you're right, Sinn Féin were inside in 98 and not in 74.
Do you want to add to that, David? It's a good question from that one.
But I'm so interested in
just the momentum, I suppose. You were there.
I mean, there's no doubt that so I suppose I wanted to reply to the question about or to the point about how we had covered a lot of the ground already.
Yeah.
So whether you relate it back to Sunday or not, from 91 on, we had the three-stranded approach laid out. So it was, and that was really common ground, and that goes back to Hume. So John Hume really came up with that analysis, we'll say, in the 70s, kind of after, more or less with and after Sunnydale. So 91 to 92, you had talks which, in fact, were mainly strand one, a little bit of strand two, we did, but we only really just touched on strand two. So we had that basis, and we then had the Downstreet Declaration, which and I forgot was it Malky made the point about the constitutional issues a moment ago, but let me make another one myself. The big advantage of the Downstreet Declaration and of the framework document linked to it, which came about a year and a half later, was that in effect we were clearing the decks on the constitutional issues and the constitutional sensitivities ahead of what became the Good Friday Agreement talks. So the point being that if we had tried to reach a constitutional understanding among two governments and 8 parties about on these deeply sensitive issues, Articles 2 and 3, it would have been impossible. And ultimately, the Irish government had the responsibility to get a referendum through on Articles 2 and 3. So it sort of made sense that the constitutional issues would be handled in a separate document. Of course, the Unionists actually liked the Downstreet Declaration. They didn't like the framework document, which came a couple of years later, because that went into more detail about the kind of institutions which might be needed if you're going to change Articles 2 and 3. Changing Articles 2 and 3 was an enormous step for nationalism. That meant that as a corollary, there had to be a fairly significant move on north-south bodies. So the framework document brought that out, which is roughly speaking why Sinn Féin, the SDLP, liked the framework document a lot, and the unions hated it. But both of those documents were really the basis for the Good Friday Agreement talk. So I suppose, some of the building blocks were already familiar. We knew the kind of shape that the Good Friday Agreement would have. We knew the kind of chapters it would have. So in a strict sense, there was no surprise. Maybe just the level of unionist concern with the north-south bodies, that went beyond what we expected. That was perhaps the main surprise in Easter week, but really it's to agree with the notion that we were roughly, it was familiar to us going into Good Friday, that nothing really surprised us at that point.
Fantastic. There's a couple here online. You might take this one, Marie. It's from Paul O'Divary. Goes, could the panel give us their understanding of EU involvement in the Good Friday Agreement as understood then and now? An hour later, Maria will still talk.
Yes, I think it does get to that point this morning. And I think the point maybe Arlene Foster missed is, obviously the EU weren't there. There wasn't an EU person in the room, but it's the way in which the joint membership of the EU facilitated meetings. In those documents, you see there were bilateral meetings. They'd be over for an EU summit, and it was yet another opportunity. It's the soft power of the EU. It's the enabling. It's not. It's not hard and fast saying, well, there was that EU person, then they came and they did that. But it's just the wider framework and things happening not just within the little Anglo-Irish bubble. There's a wider, and there's the finance. There's the peace, all the peace plans, there's the money and the general goodwill also.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what Malachy said, that in those talks in 1971 about getting this sorted before we go into the EU or the EEC, we can't take that in with us. I mean, I think one of the other things that changes between the 1970s and the 1990s is all of us, and how we talked about identity and the conversations we had, and how we learned to, way before the agreement, we had learned to speak about ourselves as being multiple rather than divided. That the idea that you could hold to being a citizen of this city, that you could have an Irishness, you could have an understanding of Northern Irishness, of Britishness, and European. That was the other one, and that all of these things were not in conflict or need not be in conflict. And I think that for me, the involvement of the EU is more about is part of the climate and the condition of the time.
And actually on that, then you wrote beautifully and brilliantly about identity way back when, long before the agreement. Malky, do you want to say something about it?
I think am I on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're overlooking the fact that the starting point really where it became possible was the IRA ceasefire. I mean, the IRA was a military organization which declared itself committed to a united Ireland, but it never had the military wherewithal to achieve that. What it did have the wherewithal to do was to veto any other possible political framework emerging in Northern Ireland, because simply the SDLP wouldn't go into government with unionists while there was intense security on the ground and while the IRA campaign was continuing. And had anyone, and there were various efforts like Prior's Assembly to establish kind of ruling devolution and some kind of structure. It was never going to happen while the paramilitary violence was continuing. So within the IRA, there was a change of mind about what their goal was and what their objective was. Then we get the argument that the IRA should have decommissioned before getting into the talks, the demand for decommissioning and how that would work out. And, the Irish, David was part of that, were part of the opposition to that demand for decommissioning. And yet I wonder, had the IRA, had the squeeze been put on them to decommission, what would they, if they'd gone back to bombing and killing, through a breakdown of the talks on that demand, what would they have been bombing and killing for? But simply for the right to have weapons, So I think that's I think they did do a really important thing. They did play their hand very, very well, and they did gain considerable advantage through the resistance to decommissioning. But essentially the start of the whole thing was the IRA saying to themselves, not out loud, apparently not even behind the door to any diplomats or whatever, but it's essentially accepting that they were going nowhere.
Okay, thanks for that, Malky. I will throw it back to the board. There's a couple more online. This one is for you, really, David. How did the idea of a mandatory power sharing come central to strand one of the agreement? Who introduced the idea into negotiations and why?
Well, I think it's important to bring out that the SDLP were very, very actively involved in the Strand 1 negotiations, more than Sinn Féin. And this was consistent with Sinn Féin's, frankly speaking, disinterest in the internal arrangements, at least at that point. And so Sinn Féin, paid lip service to the Strand 1 debate, but really the SDLP were the ones who got stuck in. And they, I think reasonably enough, felt that there had to be protection for both traditions. That's to say that there had to be, that key decisions could only be taken or approved by a majority in each tradition, and the notion of some kind of relying on the right kind of voluntary coalition coming along, it wasn't realistic against the background of unionist majoritarianism. So the SDLP were the ones who pushed the idea with support from the other parties. Must be said, I think everybody saw that something like that would be necessary. The particular idea of having a joint leadership between the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, that I think originated with Mark Durkan, and I mentioned that in my book, and it's actually quite poignant where he was with Seamus Mann and David Trimble in I think it was it Market Hill? No, it was after a bombing somewhere, and the two of them were making the points pass. They were making a symbolic visit together, and Mark realised that that was the right way forward, and frankly we all agree to that.
Do you want to add anything to that, Maria, and then Malky? No, Malky, you want?
Well, on the question of the double veto of mandatory power sharing, David, can we move beyond that now? I mean, John Hume himself said that hopefully we would move beyond the double veto. Can we move beyond to structures which cannot be brought down by one side walking out?
$1 million question, Mr. Donoghue.
I mean, I don't have very much to say in this particular setting. Personally, I'm cautious, Melody. I know there is a debate. Let's be honest. There's a debate about whether the time has come or could come shortly where you could dispense with. I don't like to call it double veto, but you're entitled to call it that way. I see that more as protection for. I mean, after all, the two traditions respectively are 40% and 40%, so it's a significant part of the Northern Ireland electorate. But the answer is, I'm not ruling out any possible sort of review in future. Speaking personally, I don't think the time has yet come. If the 20% were to expand significantly and in forthcoming elections, then I think the issue would come onto the table more squarely. But right now, call me old-fashioned, but I just don't want to take that leap of faith and move towards voluntary coalitions just yet.
Okay, fair. I'm going to throw it back to the floor. Have some more, but yeah, gentleman there. We'll give you a microphone. Thanks, man.
Hi, my name is Frank Sheridan. I'm a former colleague of David's, and I wanted to mention one or two things about the Good Friday Agreement. First of all, I've been involved a bit in the studies of the 1985 agreement in Hillsborough. And more recently, I was asked to be a member of an advisory panel involving the archives in Kew, PRONI, and in Dublin, put together at the initiative of the Secretary of State, a resource for school children, GCSE students, to study the Good Friday Agreement. And there's two dimensions to it I mentioned. One is that we were asked to put together a compendium of documents for teachers. And one document I will mention, which was written by David, is a capture of an atmospheric capture of the last 24 hours of the negotiation. And it's an outstanding document, and I have passed it to the archives in both Dublin and London and suggested it should be part of the package. The second element of it was that we were asked at the beginning of this process to identify what was different about the Good Friday Agreement than Hillsborough or Sunnydale. And two dimensions of it emerged. One being, two inputs and one output. One input being inclusivity, that it was open to every party who subscribed to the Mitchell Principles to subscribe to be engaged. And the second dimension to it was external, impartial arbitration. The fact that you did have the likes of George Mitchell there, bringing obviously a certain amount of gravitas as a former majority leader of the Senate, former judge, and also with the support of Bill Clinton, and with the issue of Northern Ireland being part of a foreign policy objective of the United States, which is looking obviously to see to what degree it might have parallels for the Middle East and so on. And the other aspect of it, which I think doesn't always get mentioned, obviously the consent principle is at the core of the outputs of the agreement. But there's two dimensions to the consent principle. One is the consent to change, but the other is the one captured by the two referenda, which is consent to the status quo, which effectively is the consent on the part of nationalists, which was missing all the way through, which in many ways is at the heart of the insurgency that occurred from 1969 onwards. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that and to make reference to David's document, which I think is one of the best pieces that I spent 3 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs overseeing the release of peace process files to the National Archives. And one of the most important documents I came across was the many reports by David, but that particular one of the last 24 hours of the Good Friday Agreement.
Thanks so much for that, Frank. Well done again, David. Another question? Yeah, gentleman here, if we could give him a microphone, second row here near the window. Thanks a million.
Suppose I should start off by saying I'm one of the slow learners. Anyway, I have a question for Marie Coleman. Yes. No, it's really about the archives.
Yes.
You know, this institution, PRONI, and indeed the National Archives, hold state papers. But I suspect that there's a much broader archive out there that has yet to be tapped into, which will give a more in-depth view. So political parties, individuals, churches, and even for instance, the prison archives now with the Ulster Museum. So to what extent do state papers actually reflect what was going on? Because often I think history, and you can see it here today, history is often seen through the big figures. But what we don't see in our debate about the Good Friday Agreement is the peacemakers, hundreds of them in this society, people talking to one another, people engaged in dialogue, people trying to work their way, and it was going on for years. And in that sense, these people laid the foundations, I think, of a slow but progress towards the Good Friday Agreement. And to what extent are they represented in the archives? Because I think we need to hear their voices. So how do you see, as you know, for instance, Queen's is building up a very important archive of this whole period. So how do you see the lack of that broad spread of archive impacted on the scholarship around periods like the Good Friday Agreement?
Of course, Tom, you're showing your other hat there, your historian. You're thinking like a historian there as your great work on Belfast history, but you're entirely right. We cannot write it purely relying on the state narrative. Now, we have the benefit, we can triangulate, and by using the Irish, the British, and the Northern Irish dimension, at least we get a more nuanced view, but we absolutely need to move outside the official version. We need those, and we need to move out of the paper version. Oral history is becoming much more important, as I'm increasingly seeing every time there's an anniversary, there are fewer people from the time here. Lord Trimble is gone, Seamus Mallon is gone since the last big one. Making sure that oral history interviews are there. And I think that's the great law. I won't go into the Boston Project, but the Northern Ireland tapes controversy was a bit of a setback on that. So we need to think beyond, even material culture, visual, the way things are represented in the art of the time. So we need to think beyond the physical archive as well. Personally, if we are to if I stay in my own patch of the historian, and yes, by and large, we use the paper record, we need to start getting personal papers. So where our NUI Galway, the University of Galway, has a wonderful collection of papers. I think they have Brendan Duddy's papers, and he was in the news much after the MI5 stuff. They have they've quite a good collection on the civil rights end of it. But we absolutely, as historians, need to not be taken in, because if we just use the state archive, then we will be in danger of giving one perspective on it.
Thanks for that, Marie.
This would work.
Yeah, it's fine. Thanks for that, Marie, and great question, Tom. Thanks. Another question from the floor? Yeah. Oh, Amanda, so sorry.
I just wanted to talk about that process of reflection, and I had done some work with Peace People and filmed Mary Corrigan Maguire and Kieran McKeown before he's passed away, and that was an oral portrait of him, and also it's a portrait of her. And also Nell McCafferty is being filmed as well, who would have been involved in the Bloody Sunday, etc. Very key journal documenting from the 80s and 70s. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that there are different approaches to memory and to society and to the practice, art practice, creative practice also has this work that can be done with archives, and the role of the artist and the writer within these structures is that conduit, and that makes that connection, which is very valid. And I just wanted to.
Thanks so much for that, Amanda. Yeah, there's a man there who just hand up. Yeah, you. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you very much. No, it's a follow-up question to Tom Hartley's question to Mary Coleman about state papers and state narratives. And I'm just wondering if Mary or any of the other panel members have a view about the educational package released by the National Archives in London the week before last, commissioned by the Secretary of State.
Yeah, I've seen it. I haven't had time to do it in more detail. By this time next year, I will have, because child number one will be doing the GCSE history next year, and is in a school where they choose the Troubles module. So I'll be interested to know what they make of that. Part of the problem there is that they are going to be shoehorned by the curriculum. And the GCSE curriculum is political history. I mean, they have they would not be doing their job in terms of helping the kids if they didn't produce. I think you're going towards sort of a critical sense there that these are very much high level state documents and they're not giving us the overview. Quite frankly, with GCSEs, you're going to have to write to the test. You're going to have to answer the questions on it. And the issue there isn't what's been produced by TNA. I welcome the fact that it has been produced by TNA. I think there's more of an understanding of the Northern Ireland issue in British institutions, because the Imperial War Museum are also doing an exhibition. But the problem there is the way in which they're circumscribed by what is quite an old-fashioned post-primary school curriculum.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I don't know the educational materials, but I mean, I do think if we're looking at archive and material that's accessible, I mean, I would like to just mention that journalism has been around a long time, and we have spoken to an awful lot of people and written articles and made programs about it. So there is a huge resource there. And also, I suppose there have been resources like the Lindenhall Library's political collection, the Orange Museum, and Damien Gorman's project on Cran, which collated an awful lot of stories. And I'm thinking of Colin Davidson's work when we're thinking of pictures. And there's been a huge, collating of material within victims groups like SEF. So there is an enormous amount of material. I'm not entirely persuaded, Tom, that there's a huge body of material overlooked. But if there is, I mean, we should be looking at it, absolutely.
I just want to say that, again, I don't know the education materials, although my daughter's just come through GCSE, and just to bear out what you say, everything's about a 4 marker, an 8 marker, a 10 marker, and a 20 marker, and how to reproduce material for that. I've often thought that actually there hasn't really been any lack of material, literature, journalism, art, PRONI, the National Archives. The difficulty is often that how do I say this? Despite the availability of all of this, despite the great events like this, that we can still hear the same things said. So what does that say? We keep doing it. We keep saying it. You keep trying. You keep trying to find new ways to say things, to make us all understand the complexity of our relationships in this part of the island, on the whole island, between the islands. That we just keep doing that. Years and years ago, I made a documentary for BBC Northern Ireland. It was 1995, and I was asked to make a documentary about Protestant culture. And I said I didn't want to do it because people would walk into their room and they'd see me on the TV and they'd say, "There's Glenn Patterson talking about being a prod," and that would be it. And I talked about in that, I called it More of It Than We Think. I took the line from Louis McNeish's Snow, "World is crazier, more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural." Our national lyric, "It should be." I looked at Protestant culture from all kinds of aspects. I looked at the McAdam and the Irish language. I looked at John Hewitt. I looked at socialism. I looked at Marianne McCracken. And I thought to myself, "Oh, look, I've done a really good thing here." And 5-10 years later, that needs to be done again, because it's a program that went out at 8:30 on BBC Two on BBC Northern Ireland in 1995. If 60,000 people saw it, that was it. We maybe just have to keep doing it and saying it again and again, because this is a really long answer, isn't it? It's just like one of those. No full stop on it either. I was just, look at the time.
Actually, no, it was a really good answer. I've got one more question I want to ask online. Does anyone on the floor want to ask another question? No, that's.
Can I just make a quick one going?
Yes, Stephen, do you want to? Yeah.
This is PRONI's 100th anniversary, and I know that when it was PRONI's 50th anniversary, it was a big call by the head of the Northern Ireland government and to give records to PRONI. So if you do feel this gap, it's never been a better time.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'll ask this other question and then we'll leave it. I'll throw it to you. I think it's probably Marie. and David again, but how does Seamus Mallon's, the one we've all spoken about today, criticism of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement look from today's perspective? Okay.
Actually, I did put poor Seamus on the spot back in a very snowy. In fact, the day we had that interview with Seamus and Noel Dorr was up in the Irish government's bunker off the Malone Road, and it was December 2017, and it was the day after Theresa May had agreed to something on Brexit on Monday, and Arlene Foster had pulled her out of the meeting and said, no, that won't do. So by Friday, they had a new version of it. And the joke going around was that Friday's deal was Monday's deal for slow learners on Brexit. So I think, like I said, Seamus made it quite clear that I think his reference applied to all those who were not in the room in 1974 and were there by 1998. If you mentioned St Andrews Agreement, I think it was it was Len mentioned St Andrews Agreement. I think pretty much everyone has come into the room since then, whether willingly or not, and some of them might have a foot outside the room and a foot inside the room. But what's the alternative? And I think gradually, let's see how happens after the 18th of May and the elections. But I think even the unwilling ones, if you look at who was not in the negotiations in 74, you go up to 1998, you go up to St Andrews, most people are now inside the tent.
I think we're a slow learning society. I think we're a divided society which hasn't copped on that politics is a bit more than identity and ethnicity. And I think we're a deeply sectarian society still. I was been looking into this, and I was reading Tony Buckley's book on identity from the 1990s. And he said there, he came to the conclusion that one of the great drivers of sectarian distinction in Northern Ireland was the sanction against mixed marriage. And he was wrong, because that sanction is gone and we're still stuck with a divided society. And the key driver, I think, of the divided society today, well, territory as well, first of all, because we live in Protestant and Catholic housing estates, schools, because we go to Catholic and Protestant schools, political parties which recruit only from Catholic or Protestant communities. I would say political party organisation facilitated and driven by the Good Friday Agreement is one of the key drivers of sectarianism and division in this slow learning society. And that's why I think we have to move well beyond this.
David, do you want? Yeah.
Well, I don't entirely agree with Malachy's last point there, but I think I take the main drift of his argument. There's no doubt that the Good Friday Agreement didn't promote, it didn't achieve its goals in relation to ending sectarianism. Okay, that was never going to happen overnight, but we can all blame ourselves that, for example, working class loyalism lost out on much of the promise of the Good Friday Agreement. It felt that Sinn Féin supporters were doing much better, and that somehow the benefits of the agreement hadn't actually percolated through to them. That's still very much the case today. So we can all blame ourselves, I suppose, collectively for not having ensured that the benefits of the agreement would reach everybody. But the problem, of course, is that the agreement has only been occasionally actually operating, indeed, at least the institutions. So we haven't really had the kind of exposure to what the agreement could mean in, if it were allowed to operate fully. So I slightly differ with Malachy on the last point, simply because I don't quite buy the idea that political parties recruit only from particular communities. I bow to your judgment, but I don't quite see, Alliance, for example, or the SDLP in that category. But okay. I get the general drift of the argument. But so look, it's really to say that I agree that. Let me come back and just very briefly to the Seamus Mallon point. I thought for a moment that when it was described as Seamus's criticism, that I thought that would be a reference to what he brings out in his book, which is his critique of the 50% plus one effect. We won't have time to get into that now. I personally don't see the reference to Sunningdale for slow learners as a criticism. I see it as simply a wry analysis, observation, which for all of us who knew Seamus Mallon would have been typical, that in effect he was, bleakly throwing his hands up and saying, couldn't we have got this 25 years earlier?
Look, I'm just going to hand over to David, who's going to close, but I just want to say it's been a privilege to be here today, a privilege to listen to David, Malachy, Marie, Amanda, and Glenn. Thanks so much. And now over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you to all the panel. I probably think you deserve another round of applause. I want to thank some of my National Archives of Ireland colleagues and my PRONI colleagues for organising today, working so closely with us. Really appreciate the cooperation and collaboration over the last number of months putting all of this together. I want to thank you all for attending. I think it's been absolutely fascinating to hear the insights from the panel and link those back to the public records that are held by both PRONI and the National Archives in Dublin, and also the National Archives in London as well. I do take Stephen's point, obviously, if anybody's interested in depositing some records, we'd be delighted to speak to you afterwards. I just want to say that we're now going to have the reception following on from this afternoon's event. It's served just at the bottom of the atrium, near where our cafe area is. You might want to go and look at the documents first, because for any conservators in the room, I know they'll be quite sort of stressed if the wine comes up to the exit. Yeah, so just keep a bit of distance, or go and have your wine and then come and look at the documents. Yes, yes, the session has been recorded, so that will be made available. And just also to thank the people who attended virtually, who weren't here in the room. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for that wider interest as well. And once again, thank you everybody for attending.